So today we are moving on into chapter 5. We're going to do section 1 vocab. There's only 2 sections in this chapter, and I try to split things up so that you have active transport on one section and passive transport on the other. So the first section we're going to do is on passive transport. So passive transport is where substances can cross the cell membrane without any input of energy. And you can have, there's 3 different types. There's diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and then osmosis. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from a high to a low concentration. So if, for example, I were to put food coloring into a beaker of water, you can see how it starts to spread out and eventually it will consume the entire beaker and an equal concentration of blue will be throughout the whole area. If you were to take cologne and spray it at one end of the room, eventually those molecules will move and diffuse themselves across the rest of the room so that everybody can smell it. Osmosis is the movement of water molecules. We're only talking about osmosis with water molecules with osmosis. So here I have a semi-permeable membrane, just like your cell membrane, and water is going to move to an area of higher concentration of solute particles. So let's say these little particles here are some really large sugar molecules, and they cannot cross this membrane. That water is going to sense that there is more molecules over here, and it's actually going to diffuse through that membrane and try to spread them out more. A hypotonic solution is the concentration of solute molecules outside of the cell is lower than the concentration in the cell. So you have fewer salt particles outside of the cell than you do inside of the cell. And that is actually going to cause the cell to swell up and burst. So the cell is getting larger. And the way I remember it is hypo kind of sounds like a hippo, and hippopotamus is a really big animal. So if it's hypotonic, the cell is going to get bigger. Hypertonic is the concentration of solute molecules outside the cell is higher than the concentration inside the cell. So this means that water is going to leave the cell and they're going to shrink up. I always think of hypertonic solutions being like somebody who's really hyper most of the time. Well, I had a friend who was extremely hyper as a child, and she was this really tiny, short little girl. And so hyper helps me to think of her because she was little and the cell's getting smaller. Isotonic, so the concentrations inside and outside of the cell are equal. So these cells are going to stay perfectly balanced. Contractile vacuole is an organelle that collects and pumps water, and then it is going to pump it out of the cell. So here we have 2 contractile vacuoles, and they are collecting water, and they're going to shove it back out.
Teachers, that ring that you just heard is the second bell that moves grade 10 and 11 to their next class. Just so you're aware tomorrow and you don't hear my friendly voice. The first bell is 9 and 12, and then that little silly ring is 10 and 11. Thank you.
Turgor pressure is the pressure that water molecules exert against the cell wall. So if you have a plant that is turgid, it's going to be standing up, it's nice and perky. When it wilts, it has lost turgor pressure. Plasmolysis is the shrinking of the cell wall. It's going to cause the plant to wilt, and that is going to happen from the central vacuole. So this whole thing here is held up by that central vacuole. When they start to lose water, the cell wall starts to lose stability, and eventually the vacuole shrinks up and the cell wall is going to kind of implode on itself. Cytolysis is when a cell bursts apart. Facilitated diffusion is a protein allowing large molecules to diffuse across the membrane, and this can happen with a protein channel or a carrier protein. And that is the last one. I'll have all these slides posted for you. I'm not going to go through the little game, but you can definitely play it on your own as a review for our vocab quiz. which will probably be next Tuesday. So we'll go over these words a few times in class, if you're in class, before you have your quiz.